So I'm here with James Arthur, who is the co-founder of Seatopia, which is a totally visionary company that is leading the movement in regenerative aquaculture. And they are bringing direct-to-consumer, clean, sustainably raised, mercury-tested, microplastic-tested fish to the market that is the safest fish you can buy today. I am such a big fan. You hear me talk so much about regenerative agriculture, and what I'm really excited about this conversation is to introduce my audience and anyone else who's listening to this amazing concept of regenerative aquaculture. So, James is an optimist and an ocean steward. He lived on a sailboat for over a decade, traveling the Pacific, vetting aquaculture farms and linking up these amazing farms with top innovative chefs to provide the best seafood for them. And then in 2020, started Seatopia to bring this incredible fish to consumers. So we just had like the best lunch of my entire life, eating a bunch of Seatopia fish, all raw. It was incredible. And I'm so excited to learn more from you today. Thank you so much, James.
That's a great intro. Thank you. I appreciate you being open to have these conversations and being a champion of regenerative agriculture. And that lays such a beautiful foundation for what we're trying to do with our oceans.
And the oceans cover like how much of the world's surface?
70%.
70%.
And that's just the surface. When you look at the depth, I mean, this is the blue planet. This is not Earth. Earth is an absolute misnomer. We look at this through this lens of Earth, but absolutely, when you step back and look at how the whole ecosystem works on this planet, this is the blue planet. This is ocean, much more than Earth.
Oh my gosh, yeah. We think about farming and agriculture and sustainable agriculture. I mean, I think most of us think about just land-based, but there's so much more that can help people and the planet. So I can't wait to jump in. I would love to start with just some personal stories. Like you lived on a boat for over 10 years, which is incredible. I'd love to hear how you got started living on a boat and maybe just a little bit about where you adventured and how you started connecting with regenerative aquaculture farms all over the Pacific.
Yeah. Well, my wife and I lived on a boat for almost a decade, and during COVID, we had a little bit more space in our schedule. The restaurants that we had been working with all closed down, and so we decided, hey, one day I wanted to go sail around the world, and I dragged her along with, right? But I had enough space in our schedule, and we took off on this grand adventure, and we sailed from Los Angeles all the way down to Central America, and we saw so many incredible places, but a lot of things that were very disturbing as well, right? Like we came across illegal fishing vessels in the Galapagos National Park. We came across beaches that should have been pristine that were covered in plastic. So there was wonderful, wonderful things that we saw along the way, but also, you know, I've read all these reports about increasing mercury levels in the oceans and increasing microplastics, but to go somewhere that you've dreamt about your entire life since you were a child and invest so much of your time and energy and end up seeing plastics all over the beaches was really disturbing. And it's a little harder to see the microplastics, but they've now invaded everything. Anyways, along the way, we got pregnant, as happens when you're isolated on a boat, having these romantic experiences. It's hard not to, but it really brought into focus the importance of clean fish, right? Like I take great pride in knowing how to catch fish, spearfishing, when you know what the mercury levels are, because I've been ingrained and deeply immersed in all the reports on ocean health for years. I had to reconsider what I was feeding my wife, and I had to change our habits. And there was enough awareness and data on aquaculture practices that could raise fish on a low mercury diet by having lower trophic feed. So instead of feeding a fish or a fish eating sardines, anchovies, mackerel, further up the food chain, eating just at the base food of the trophic levels, the microalgae throughout their entire life, results in magnitudes lower levels of mercury. And this data has been known. There's been a lot of demonstrated pilot projects doing this, but not commercially available. So that epiphany was I had connections to some of the farms that had these pilot projects, but the epiphany was Seatopia needs to be the champion of this particular type of farming and these particular feeds in order to produce healthier, low mercury, no microplastic, no detectable microplastic, high omega-3 seafood. Those projects were already in pilot, but they needed to be brought to mainstream. And that was sort of the pivot into what Seatopia is doing today. But the journey was like, we just wanted to see all the aquaculture facilities along the coast. We wanted to see all the marine protected areas. And it brought to just so vividly that the oceans are changing in a very rapid and dynamic way. And what I used to feel comfortable eating doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah. Wow. So just kind of getting into like your personal story even a little bit more, like what was your first touch point with this whole concept of regenerative aquaculture? Like what got you seeking out these farms? Was that an industry that you were in before? Like how did that develop?
Well, the inception was this gentleman that I worked with when I was a teenager. Actually, I started volunteering at an aquarium in San Diego, in Chula Vista. There's a aquarium. At the time, it was called the Nature Interpretive Center. It's out on this estuary, this marshland in Chula Vista, South San Diego Bay. And out in the middle of the estuary, there's this beautiful aquarium where they have bat rays and stingrays and leopard sharks. And there was a steelhead trout rehabilitation project. And it was demonstrating that this species, steelhead trout, that used to be abundant in these areas throughout Southern California, steelhead trout would go from the ocean up into the rivers, into the lakes, and back again. And they were an integral part of the ecosystem and a food source for a lot of people and animals. But because of the way we've changed rivers and pollution, they may or may not be extinct within the next couple of years. Like there was, the last count was like less than 100, and that was right before these big fires. And the fires are devastating the local ecosystem. Anyways, this rehabilitation project was demonstrating how we could raise these steelhead trout in captivity from egg, bring them to maturity, and release them back into the wild, or release them at various stages into the rivers and allow them to go back. And we also demonstrated that they could be raised to maturity and harvested. So he was like, this is aquaculture's potential to rehabilitate and to feed. And that deep understanding at that early age that we can farm in the ocean and we can rehabilitate. We didn't really have the ideas, the naming convention of regenerative aquaculture back then, but it was restorative potential of aquaculture practices was really what piqued my interest. Yeah. And then 20 years later, I had the opportunity to pursue aquaculture in Mexico. I found a farm that was producing some of the best quality yellowtail in the world, and I wanted to go and work with them from a mission of being a good steward. And this farm's practices was some of the most innovative. And I said, I want to go and work with the most innovative aquaculture facility. And that's how I got into aquaculture. But at that time, it was really just like, how do you produce the most sustainable seafood? And there's often a difference between sustainable and healthy, because sustainable doesn't mean as much today as maybe it used to. There's a lot of greenwashing, and just because something's sustainable doesn't mean that it's really healthier for humans or even for the animals, for that matter. We could chat more on that. We should dive into that subject.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a big difference between something like sustaining the status quo and regenerating and making better.
Yeah. Well, I think that the big question, and I'm sure you get asked this so much, but like farmed fish has such a bad rap now. And, we all know people who are like, I would never eat farmed fish. It's just so toxic and whatnot. Like regenerative aquaculture is totally different, but that's still a gap that I think is misunderstood. Like how would you describe the difference for people to conceptualize between farm fish and a different kind of farm fish, regeneratively aquaculture raised fish?
In the same analogy of what's the difference between factory farmed chickens and pasture chickens, or factory farmed cattle and regenerative cattle, rotational crop grazing and integrated multi-trophic aquaculture is an example of permaculture, or multi-species working symbiotically together. So an example of factory farmed aquaculture that a lot of people initially think of, the stigma, is high density farming on cheap feeds being sold to people who don't ask questions. But there's also high quality farming where fish and shellfish are raised on diets that optimize for the healthiest animals, that have the most robust immune system, that have the most nutrient density. And that model is completely different. You have to have a different environment, you have to have different feed, you have to have different buyers. There has to be a whole ecosystem to support it, and it simply doesn't fit in today's modern commodity distribution channels. Mm-hmm. People aren't willing to pay what that type of farming costs. If you raise fish on microalgae and insect protein, most distributors and retailers aren't interested in that. And they're definitely not interested in paying a premium for it. But underlying all that is a better way to steward the oceans, the environments, and to raise fish and shellfish and microalgae in symbiotic relation. Mm-hmm. So regenerative aquaculture is just mimicking natural ecosystems, learning how to raise animals, seafood in these sort of symbiotic relationships. It's very different than monocultures optimizing for the lowest cost production. So, but there's not like one specific type of regenerative aquaculture that fits all around the world. In fact, every single farm in every environment is different. And it's, most farmers would say we're just humble stewards learning how to steward this land and what works best in this environment. But it generally involves multiple species working symbiotically together. And one example is finfish, and that is a fish that has fins and is swimming around and oftentimes needs to be fed and poops. And the poop in nature, like we were talking about earlier, compost, is not inherently bad for the environment. In fact, inherently, there's no such thing as waste in nature. There's always a symbiotic co-partner, and the fish poop, rich in ammonia, phosphorus, nitrates, is actually superfood for the environment when there is the right symbiotic partner. And those symbiotic partners are things like shellfish and kelp and microalgae and bottom feeders like shrimp and oysters and sea urchins and crabs and lobster. When you have a handful of different species in proximity working symbiotically, you can create these beautiful regenerative ecosystems that in many ways can have high density in a healthy way. Like if you think about a rainforest or a coral reef, you have high density abundance because of diversity. If you only had one species, any disruption could completely wipe out that population. But in those high density environments, you have all those symbiotic relationships. So we're learning how to integrate different species together to catalyze those ecosystem services that each one provides. And as long as the input to the feed at the top are clean, then you're actually just creating these beautiful new ecosystems.
Wow. That's so cool. I mean, it's like it's everything you're saying sounds like an identical parallel to regenerative agriculture in the words you're using, the ecosystems and the, that there's no waste. And some of the things I think about with, I think the vision that's so easy for people to understand with like the difference between conventional agriculture and regenerative agriculture is like what you were talking about. There's like cattle feedlots where they're living in squalor and terrible conditions. They're crammed together. They're separated from their families. They're high stress. They're being antibiotics, hormones. The poop is just everywhere, but not being used effectively. It actually ends up in landfills generally, all of that. So it's awful conditions for everyone, and it's a lot of breaking of cycles. And then you think of the regenerative farm, and it's like a cow grazing on beautiful lush grasses and pasture, and there's bees and birds and pollinators and other plants growing, and the poop is serving the soil, and their hooves are gently like agitating the soil. Everything's working together, and it's really beautiful and lovely, and it's a complex ecosystem working together to create resilience. So some of the issues that we think about with like a conventional farm would be like, synthetic pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, really bad feed, just like GMO corn and soy, and, not using cover crops, aggressive tilling, all that stuff, no crop rotation. Are there like parallels to that and what's happening in paint the picture of like that conventional farm versus regenerative farm for a conventional farmed fish versus a regeneratively farmed fish? Like how does it look and feel different? How are the inputs different? You mentioned food a little bit, but
it's so similar. In fact, a lot of the large industrial agriculture producers are their owners or stakeholders or investors are the exact same people who own the largest aquaculture facilities that are producing commodity seafood. And it makes perfect sense because they are feeding them GMO corn and soy and canola oil.
Oh my God.
And when you feed fish GMO corn and soy and canola oil, they surprisingly have a very similar response that you and I have, is they get inflammation, their immune system is lowered, fatty liver disease, all these symptoms are showing up in fish. And yet, if people aren't asking what's in the feed, they just want cheaper fish, then that's what they're going to get.
Wow.
And when the fish don't have this natural immune system that's rich in DHA and EPA because they're just getting all these omega-6s from canola oil, their elevated inflammation levels and lowered immune systems, they're more susceptible to disease, so they feed them preventative antibiotics.
Oh, yeah.
And that is commodity seafood, commodity farm seafood. And it's not happening because aquaculture farmers and marine biologists got into the industry saying they want to produce cheap fish and degrade the ocean. In fact, every single marine biologist comes into aquaculture wanting to be a good steward. But there's this market force that is not incentivizing healthier seafood, that continually breaks down the business model of all of these farmers and says, we'll pay you based on species and country of origin. We're not going to ask or incentivize anything else. Like if it's an Atlantic salmon from Norway, this is what we're going to pay you. If it's a Campachi from Mexico, this is what we're going to pay you. And that was my experience working firsthand, that if we didn't change our business model, if we didn't find a way to sell outside of these commodity distribution channels, our business would fail, right? So once upon a time, I was selling whole fresh fish from the best farms in the world to farm-to-table chefs in Southern California, bringing those chefs to the farm and eating the feed with them and letting them swim in these beautiful pens and seeing, this is beautiful, this is healthy. And when you do things this way, yeah, it costs more, but the result is so much better, right? Yeah. And then the next iteration was, well, we can also use feeds that optimize for the most nutritious seafood.
Yeah.
We can use these, for example, with steelhead trout and salmon, they're actually insectivores, which means they eat insects, especially in their juvenile phase. When they're up in the river systems, they're eating flies and insects. That's why fly fishing is a thing. When you go fly fishing, fish are biting on something that looks like an insect or a fly because it's part of their natural instinct, and that's part of their natural diet. It's a species appropriate element. When you feed them insect protein, I don't necessarily want to eat insect protein. I'm not going to be force-fed like insect protein energy bars. Is not where I want to go just because it's a scalable, nutritious thing. But it's actually appropriate for
it's not a species-specific diet for us.
Exactly.
Right? But it is for fish, it sounds like. Yeah. For certain fish, yeah.
Like salmon and trout. We were bringing chefs, farm-to-table chefs, that had a business model that benefits from having an authentic connection to where their chickens and their beef and their tomatoes come from, right? That's a different business model than most restaurants, right? When these businesses have that and they can tell that story, they're successful and their food is good and people are appreciative of that. Those chefs love what we're doing, and them coming to the farm just brought that authenticity and that story and that connection and that quality to them. But we shifted even into this more nuanced way with what we're doing today is how do we not just do things sustainably and locally, but how do we produce the healthiest seafood? And that's really what we're looking at today is quantifying mercury levels. Like I want to help foster production of seafood that has higher levels of EPA and DHA. And you can do that when you have a clean environment with clean feed, clean inputs. You consistently get much cleaner outputs, right? As opposed to environments that are increasingly becoming more toxic in the ocean with the bioaccumulation of all of the toxins that we continue to dump into the ocean, into our rivers and streams. When you have clean environments with clean feed, you predictably get clean outputs. And when you optimize for higher levels of omega-3s in the feed, you get fish with higher levels of omega-3s. When you optimize for feeds that are much lower on the trophic level, that have magnitudes less mercury and microplastics, you get fish with lower levels of mercury and microplastics.
That's so interesting. Like, I think something I was going to ask you was, okay, these fish are all in the ocean, and the ocean is now filled with microplastics and a lot of fish that have mercury in them. And so how do you protect fish essentially from the microplastics, mercury, dioxins, all these things that are in the water, since they're in the water? But I think what I hear you saying is that if you are feeding them a really high quality, non-GMO, omega-3 rich algae-based feed,
yes,
then the input, there's going to be less, they're not bioaccumulating from eating other fish that already have mercury. But what's interesting to me is that that's a little bit, and maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, like a difference from what we think about with regenerative agriculture, which is like, of course, the phrase pasture raised or like grass fed is sort of ideal. So the idea is like, okay, we want the cows out on their natural environment. It sounds like for fish, because the natural environment is actually very problematic because the fish have a lot, like the fish that the fish are eating have plastics in them and mercury. It's actually better to feed them a feed that's clean and healthy. So it's like farm fish eating GMO soy and corn, bad. Fish eating regular other fish and bioaccumulating stuff, kind of bad too. Best case scenario is actually a high quality controlled EPA, DHA rich feed. Is that accurate? Or
you could say that, but I'm going to be careful because nuance is really important here, right?
Give us the nuance.
The scenario is different in every specific environment, but we look at aquaculture kind of at like aquaculture 3.0 is where we're at today. And I'll back up to 1.0, which was literally just taking salmon from the wild, getting them to breed, putting the fingerlings, the small ones, in pens, and feeding them ground up bait fish that they would normally eat in the wild. Mm-hmm. That gives the fish a very similar nutrient profile to what the wild fish would get because you're just taking wild bait fish and grinding it up. What is in that wild bait fish is increasingly becoming more toxic, and that's a problem. The other compounding problem is that there's less and less bait fish. There is a finite supply of wild fish in the ocean, and that has actually plateaued. There is less and less available. The data is not showing that we're going to find more wild-caught fish somewhere in deeper water. It's showing less and less every year. And so there's been a global initiative pushed by large non-governmental organizations and government organizations like the UN to say aquaculture is an imperative. We need to keep feeding people seafood, but we can't keep getting more from the ocean. That's clear. But if we're going to raise fish in farms, we should stop putting pressure on the bait fish. And so the industry moved towards feeding fish with proteins from land. Because there's this finite supply and we need to reduce pressure on the wild stock. So they started feeding them land-based proteins. And what are the most affordable land-based proteins?
Like corn and soy.
The subsidized
things that are
GMO
subsidized,
corn and soy. And that's sort of aquaculture 2.0. And some people would say that it's more sustainable because you're not taking bait fish out of the ocean to feed farm-raised fish. The problem is that is not producing healthier fish, and it's producing weaker fish with weakened immune systems that then need antibiotics and all these other things. Aquaculture 3.0 is where we're saying, how do we raise fish in the cleanest, healthiest way that's scalable and healthy? And so one scenario that you're referring to is feeding them. And so feeding them a pelletized diet made in a large manufacturing facility that is actually optimizing for omega-3s, EPA, and DHA, and then pairing that with truly scalable species-appropriate nutrients like insect protein, mycelium proteins, things that specifically benefit the animals and are scalable. That is aquaculture 3.0 in one scenario. There's other scenarios though. There's land-based recirculating aquaculture systems, literally on land, recirculating the water, not using any fresh water, reusing all the water, not putting any of the pollutants back into the environment. We work with a farm that has this really cool filtration system where they actually are growing plants, including marijuana plants and other plants that filter the nutrients out of the fish poop out of the water, and that feeds the plants. And they're raising these fish without any corn, any soy, in a really clean, beautiful way. That is a land-based recirculating aquaculture system. We also work with farms that are not feeding them anything. So, for example, there's species like scallops that are just filter feeders, and they are eating zooplankton and phytoplankton. Because they are low trophic species, they're not bioaccumulating the levels of mercury that you might see with a tuna or even a salmon, because they're always eating at this base trophic level. They're never going, those scallops are never going and eating sardines and anchovies and mackerel, etc. They're staying at this level. So when we test, and all of this is data driven, when we test scallops that are extensively feeding in this environment, the levels of mercury are very, very low. So much so that they're less than 0.0 parts per million. Microplastics and other issues, other toxins can be an issue though, depending on where they're sourced. So you have to be very careful on where you're sourcing your filter feeders from. Another example of extensive aquaculture is the farm in Cadiz, Spain, Esteros Lubemar, which evolved from Beta La Palma, which is this estuary that has been rehabilitated. It was a drained estuary turned into a cattle farm, and that was just completely degraded in this environment. These gentlemen came in about 25 years ago, reflooded the canals, reconfigured the way that the water would flow to be very efficient at creating a abundant environment for microalgae that in turn created a healthy, abundant environment for a local species of shrimp. And they had this huge proliferation of shrimp, and then they introduced hatchery-raised branzino and sea bream. And those branzino and sea bream are eating all of these shrimp that are rich in DHA and EPA from the microalgae that is abundant in this environment. And now you have this estuary that is flowing very efficiently throughout here, creating this abundantly healthy ecosystem that also has this huge biodiversity of flamingos and osprey and this myriad of other species, mullet, and all of these species are existing here today because the farmer said, how do we optimize the environment to create abundance that would not only be able to feed us and we could export and feed the world, but then also creates a healthy environment for all the birds and all the wildlife. And some people might say, oh, you're wasting, so much fish, allowing these birds to come and prey and all that. But if you approach it from sort of a regenerative principles, that where there's lots of life, there's lots of death, and you need predators to help cull and clean. And the sign of predators is a sign of a healthy ecosystem, right? Like when we go diving and we don't see sharks, there's not enough healthy environment. When you see sharks, it's a sign that there's an abundance of life as well, right? So, there's different models of regenerative aquaculture that meet different environments around the world.
So that fish we had for lunch today didn't get any feed. They were eating the shrimp that ate the algae.
They ate that throughout the majority of their life, like 70%. 30% they did get feed, and they get a healthy feed that mimics what we're talking about.
Wow.
But it is the majority of their life on this.
Yeah.
And that model is absolutely replicable around the world. Like we could be doing that in estuaries around the world. We can take often overlooked environments and bring them into the center of our food systems, right? Like if you think about estuaries and how they were perceived by humans 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, an estuary was the cornerstone of the local community because our ancestors would go to estuaries to eat shellfish and catch fish and have a stable, healthy source of omega-3s and proteins. That was a lot lower risk than going and hunting a buffalo, right? Yeah. When we migrated around the world, we migrated following the coastline, following estuaries. And when we start to appreciate the value of these ecosystems today, we could literally change our relationship to the ocean because these are keystone environments. These estuaries are very important breeding grounds and nurseries for so many species. And when we start to celebrate these types of farms and these environments, we can really rehabilitate the larger ecosystems around.
It's when you were talking about that sequence of events, like you had this estuary that had been drained to make a cattle farm. Yeah. And then to rehabilitate it, it started with the algae and then the shrimp and then the fish, and the birds are eating the fish, and it becomes a whole thriving ecosystem. It reminds me of some of the farmers I've talked to that are cattle ranchers, regenerative cattle ranchers. They're like, oh no, I don't really raise cows. I raise grass.
Yes.
And then everything else comes from that. So they're actually grass I mean, it's a joke, but it's like, I'm a grass farmer. Yeah. And then from that, all the bigger life comes from that. And it feels like there's a little bit of a parallel there with the ocean of like, if you can cultivate algae, you get a lot of things coming from that. That's really beautiful.
Absolutely.
Wow.
It's those even deeper, right? It's like not even this grass, it's the soil and what's in it, the microbes, right? And the same thing in the ocean. It's the microalgae and all the relationships at that microscopic level.
Yeah.
That's where all life on this planet originated.
Right. Yeah. It's amazing.
And we still operate with these as core parts of our biology, right? Like our eyeballs are DHA, the gray matter is DHA, like EPA is heart healthy, all these things. It's no wonder we all evolved from the ocean. We evolved eating seafood because it worked for our ancestors and it continues to work for us today. Yeah.
Well, you were talking about like in the past, the estuaries were like a centerpiece of how we lived. So I was curious to ask you, like, is this idea of regenerative ocean farming, regenerative aquaculture, is this a new innovation, or is this actually more of like a traditional and indigenous technology that we like lost and that is coming back now aided by technology? Or like, what is, I mean, I feel like the answer is going to be like, oh yeah, tribes were doing this for millennia and we lost it. But what's the history?
It's both, right? Yeah. So definitely we are learning to do it with technology, but in Asian rice paddies, they put tilapia out there, and the tilapia it's this multi-trophic environment. Here in Hawaii, there's this tradition of fish ponds where the natives would grow many different species of fish in these ponds and cultivate them. Some of the species would come and breed in there. Others would just come and get trapped in there at high tide with different rock structures, sort of tide pool systems. And then they would grow until they could be harvested. But aquaculture with carp and all these species goes back thousands and thousands of years. We're just learning how to do it respectfully, right? Like a couple people got the idea of aquaculture and said, let's apply the same business model that we applied to industrial scale farming to industrial scale aquaculture, and they did what they did. But there's this resurgence of farmers who really want to be good stewards of the ocean, who want to grow microalgae, who want to rehabilitate their local estuaries and their fish ponds and raise fish in a symbiotic way. And that is the regenerative aquaculture movement. That is this respect and rekindling of practices that, could be considered, ancestral practices. How do we do it with the knowledge that we have today? And like technology to grow a species like Schizocrytia, which is this species of microalgae that NASA identified as having the most potential for growing healthy proteins and omegas in space, right? Wow. They looked at all these different species and they said, this is the one that we're going to take to the space station and all that. And today, it is a cornerstone of aquaculture 3.0. This particular species that can break down plant matter and cellulose and turn it into fatty omega-3s and EPA and DHA is unlocking so much more potential, right? So we are absolutely looking at ancestral practices in a new way. And but the biggest thing is just humility to realize that we shouldn't be optimizing for large monocultures where humans sit at the top of the pyramid, but learning how to mimic ecosystems that have evolved for millennia. And we just need to be a part of helping catalyze those ecosystem services to work in symbiotic relation.
I don't know if this stat is correct, but I had heard that 90+% of carbon on Earth is actually stored in the oceans, or some really high number that is becoming more problematic because the ocean temperatures are rising and there's less ability to store carbon in the ocean. And I might be off on that, so correct me. But one of the, again, benefits that people love about regenerative agriculture is that unlike conventional agriculture with really shallow root systems and the tilling that releases a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, it's about building these, you've got this porous, biologically active soil that you can build these huge root systems, which is basically 3D printing carbon, and then you get more biodiversity, and all this printing of matter is actually storing carbon, and then you're not tilling and releasing it, all that. So you were telling me at lunch something about the storage of carbon in a scallop shell. But the question I'm curious about is how does this type of farming potentially restore some of the capability of the ocean to be, for instance, a carbon sink, or to help with the healing of the ocean in the same way that on land regenerative agriculture is trying to heal our soil? Are there parallels there as well? Does it contribute to ocean health?
Absolutely.
Wow.
It's whenever I hear somebody say that regenerative agriculture is the largest potential ecosystem service that we can catalyze to sequester carbon, I think that's cool. Go do that. But it's misguided. If you're looking for the largest lever, it is this blue planet's ecosystem services to sequester carbon. You have enormous systems moving carbon cycles from the surface into deep and upwelling and all these different systems. You have species like blue whales that eat enormous quantities of carbon at the surface and then dive and poop and store it down in the deep. There is data that shows just phytoplankton and zooplankton moving up to the surface to photosynthesize and then sinking down into the nutrient-rich waters at night is moving immense amounts of carbon. The ecosystem services and the ability to catalyze those sort of carbon cycles has far more potential in the ocean than it does on land. I think it is, it's just kind of out of sight for a lot of people, right? But if you think about the example we talked about earlier was the shell of a scallop, right? So regenerative raised scallop is different than a bottom trawl caught scallop. Like a trawler goes out and just scrapes the ocean floor, and the ocean trawlers are like the least efficient fishing vessels in the world. It's just dragging this super heavy net across the ocean floor and literally just opening up all of the stored carbon and putting all this silt into the ocean to capture some shells that were down there.
Oh my God.
Very disruptive to ocean floor, very disruptive to all the different species. It's like going through a rainforest with a bulldozer, right? Regenerative raised scallops are raised from seed in a hatchery, put into these lantern baskets. They filter the water, and as they're growing their shells through the process of calcification, they're pulling carbon out of the ocean and storing it in these shells. And then that shell is literally holding that carbon there. And it is a process that when we're scaling regenerative aquaculture with things like scallops that work symbiotically with finfish or kelp or other species like mussels and oysters, they are all pulling carbon. And then you have species like the fastest growing organisms on the planet are like giant kelp. They can grow, in some cases at 2 feet a day. It's incredible. And they are creating these carbon structures. What happens to those? Are they being harvested and then fed to cattle, or are they literally just sinking back to the ocean? But if you're leaving kelp in the water, if you're leaving these carbon structures in the ocean, you absolutely are creating incredible infrastructure to sequester carbon. The other interesting thing about regenerative aquaculture and these sort of integrated multi-trophic systems is that you can actually raise fish in previous dead zones. So, for example, you can't grow kelp in an environment where there's no nutrients. And large swaths of the ocean are low nutrient environments, oleotrophic environments, where there's just not enough nutrients to grow filter feeders or dissolved particulate filter. But if you have a open ocean aquaculture facility where you're raising fish that are pooping, they're distributing those nutrients into the environment. All of a sudden you can grow these kelps and you can grow these filter feeders and you can create these fish attracting devices, these environments that previously were dead zones, and all of a sudden in the middle of a desert you have this oasis with all this life. And these systems are now aggregating carbon, right? There's now more density of carbon in the ocean than there was before, right? We're starting to see how rehabilitating ecosystems is rehabilitating the whole ecosystem's levers. All of these systems work together. So, yeah, I mean, I think from the perspective of ecosystem services, regenerative aquaculture hasn't even come into its full potential. We can when big money starts to move for those sort of purposes, we will be able to move. There's a really large lever. At the moment, what's moving it is nutrition, because people are, at least like what's happening right now is people are voting for regenerative aquaculture because we can produce more nutrient-dense, cleaner seafood, and that affects people like personally. That's not out of sight, out of mind. That's literally like I'm checking my nutrient levels. I see my omega-3 levels. I see my mercury levels. And my functional medicine doctor said I need more omegas and protein, but less mercury. And
Yep.
Seatopia might be part of that solution.
Totally. Yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit. In my own little family, we want to start a family, and it's so interesting. I feel like the first things you hear when you think about pregnancy is everything that has to do with fish. It's like you can't have high mercury fish. There's all these lists on the CDC and the EPA website where there's best, good, and bad, and you can have 3 servings of the best, 1 serving of the good, 0 servings of the bad per week total. And if you do more than that, or maybe the fish is higher mercury than you thought, it could literally be neurotoxic to the brain of the fetus. So that's concerning. When it's odd, because fish, theoretically, if it were safe, would be one of the best foods you could possibly eat for a baby's brain because it has EPA and DHA. Then on top of the fish, that part, the mercury part, you can't have any raw fish or smoked fish because of the risk, I think, more of infection.
Yeah.
So it's like avoid all fish, even though it's the best thing for the baby's brain. And then with mercury, my husband and I had spent like a month in Hawaii and ate a bunch of tuna, and we went back and did Function Health, our labs, and the mercury was through the roof. And, after avoiding fish for several months, it went back down. But yeah, it's just a lot to think about. So tell me about what you guys are doing to test fish and what the results are showing about Seatopia and safety and what people should know.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that personal story because it resonates really with exactly the sort of origin story for Seatopia. When my wife got pregnant, we had those same concerns. Like, how do we get the lowest levels of mercury and really optimize for the highest levels of omega-3s? We are lab testing every lot of seafood that we receive, and we reject seafood that has a level of mercury defined by the FDA as not safe for a pregnant woman to consume 3 times a day, 7 days a week. There is published numbers on like the recommended dosage or safe dosage for various risk levels. Mm-hmm. And pregnant women is one of the highest risk levels. And we said, well, if my wife can't eat it, when, for example, in her 3rd trimester, she felt uncomfortable eating anything other than sushi grade seafood because she just couldn't digest it. She was like, oh, I just feel nauseous, or I feel in other things, but sushi grade seafood, she was like, I want to eat this. Mm-hmm. This feels like I can digest it. Well, how do we get her product that is clean, and which ones are clean? And when we lab test all of the seafood, and the funny thing is, working in aquaculture for many years, we were lab testing seafood already. Mm-hmm. Maybe we weren't doing it as often as we do now with Seatopia, but at farms, we were testing things annually at least, mm-hmm. right? That data allowed us to see what's actually ending up in the fish. What are the histamine levels? How much mercury is in the fish? We had that data. And I now was like, well, I want to know that as a consumer. Mm-hmm. I want to know that with every lot, not just once a year. And so we're testing every single lot, and we're saying if it doesn't have less than 0.0 parts per million of mercury, if it doesn't have less than that, it's not going to be on the Seatopia. It doesn't get the Seatopia label.
So 0 mercury.
It's not 0. It's less than 0.1 parts per million.
0.1 parts per million.
So
got it.
We don't say it's 0 mercury. It's just mercury safe according to those standards. And there's literally a calculator. You can apply that to how much you weigh and what species you want to eat. And if you apply that same calculation to the data on how much mercury is in a piece of tuna, for example, it would say that you probably shouldn't eat more than a paper clip's weight of tuna per day, right? It's wow, very, very small slice,
right? Right.
But the fish that we ate today, you could eat it 3 times a day, 7 days a week, and not accumulate those same exposure levels.
Wow.
And then when it comes to parasites and microplastics, we have tests for this stuff as well. And the way that, so there's the microplastics test, again, it's not zero microplastics.
Right.
It's zero detectable microplastics, which means a microplastic is a specific size. And anything less than that doesn't show up on these tests. It's possible that there are nanoplastics in there, but it's very hard to get a nanoplastic tester.
Yeah.
So when fish are raised in specific environments, in specific with specific feeds, they're not bioaccumulating and not getting those high levels. So we've literally had to say no to some sources. We've had some farms in our system that didn't pass, and they had to, be removed from our catalog because something changed.
Yeah.
But if it is in the Seatopia catalog, it has the strictest testing and requirements because it needed to be safe for our family.
Wow.
And other families like that.
This is such a technical question, but how do you actually test for microplastics? Is it a visual test under a microscope, or is it they can test the chemicals, the breakdown products of plastic?
I think there's two different ones. There's a microplastic, there's a microscope test, and it also uses light to reflect certain things.
Okay.
And then I think after that, they can also identify the types of plastic. So they can identify, is it from fibers or is it from like PET plastics?
Yeah.
And you can see very clearly, like in certain parts of the world, that you see more of like in California, you see more of the microfiber plastics. And then in like Asia, there's a lot more of the PET in the seafood. Yeah.
So when we're thinking about how fish are getting this stuff inside of them, it's actually not them ingesting the water. It's mostly bioaccumulation of eating other fish, which is why the feed and the other ways that the fish are being raised is, because that's kind of a misconception I had. I thought maybe they were just living in the ocean and they just would get mercury and microplastics, but it sounds like it's more based on what they're eating.
Based on all the tests that we've done and all the data, fish simply swimming in the environment is not accumulating toxicity into their systems. It's what they're eating, because most of these fish are not eating microplastics. Some of them will eat large particles of plastic, and you can see that, like if you go fishing, you can see large particles of plastics in their stomach when you harvest them.
Oh my God.
But microplastics that get into the flesh of fish comes from smaller organisms.
Wow.
And so what we've seen is like fish swimming in a plastic pen. So for example, the recirculating aquaculture system, we work with a handful of them, and the pens are literally made out of a type of plastic.
Yeah.
But those fish, when we test them, are not showing levels of microplastics because of the feed. So it's not just the environment. Unless someone was going in there and like shaving off the edges, and then the fish were literally eating that, but they're not. They're eating a specific feed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I can tell you this conclusively, that we test all of this, and it's not environmental exposure, it's bioaccumulation through feed that has the ability to get into concentrated levels in the flesh.
Yeah. Wow.
In the fat. The mercury, for example, binds to the fatty tissues, and that goes up and biomagnifies. And that's why when you see like a whale wash up on shore, it has toxic levels of mercury because it's at the top of the food chain.
Yeah. So are whales they're accumulating tons of mercury?
So much so that some scientists are saying that killer whales may go extinct, not because we're overfishing them or anything, but their reproductive systems are just failing. They have such high levels of mercury. Oh my God.
And it must be, is there any evidence that it's neurologically hurting them too? Like, because they're such smart animals who use so much sensory capability for their migrations and things. Like, I just wonder if it's creating whales that maybe won't function as well.
Yeah, there's some confusion about what's causing some of these mass strandings. Some people say it's sonars, but other people believe that there's just confusion happening there.
What is mass stranding?
There's unexplained strandings where like whales, like an entire pod will just swim up onto the shore and it looks like a suicide.
Oh, jeez.
Or they're just completely confused. And some people think it's neurological issues and they do autopsies. Other people say that Other times it's been associated to things like deep water mining, and the sonars that they're using are these incredibly loud blast systems, and that is disorienting as well to the whales.
Jeez, that's devastating. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, and one other thing I was going to ask about was with the commercial fishing industry, and I did get this stat from Seaspiracy, which, was a documentary that was, I think, more focused on trying to get people to go vegan and not eat fish.
I agree with that.
Which is so interesting because, again, just so many parallels with the agriculture. There's so many documentaries about veganism that talk about the environmental devastation of the way we're raising cows and animals without recognizing that there's a different way to raise animals that actually promotes biodiversity. And so, but it was a very interesting film in the sense that it really, I think, sounded the alarm on how much our oceans are struggling. And I think one of the stats that stood out was that almost 50% of the ocean plastic in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is just fishing nets. And so that's like a huge source of we think about it's like plastic straws and to-go containers, but it's actually like the commercial fishing industry. So can you share a little bit about how does regenerative aquaculture help with the ocean plastic issue in any way? Or how would we think about plastic in relation to this industry versus commercial fishing industry? And would an ideal scenario in your mind be that we actually move towards almost no wild caught fishing and actually doing almost all fishing through regenerative aquaculture? What is your grand vision for how we heal the oceans through our fishing culture? No big deal.
Yeah. Well, first I want to just say that the Seaspiracy filmmakers made a really great movie, and they're great filmmakers.
Yeah.
It was a compelling story that had me on the edge of my seat. But I also know enough to know that they were cherry picking data, and they have a very vegan agenda, and they did the same thing when they made Cowspiracy. They made that film as well. What they did really well was highlight a lot of the problems in the ocean.
Yeah.
Many very real problems, both with farm fish, factory farm fish, and industrial scale fisheries. That number is absolutely correct. It's been substantiated that the majority of the plastics in the Great Pacific Gyre originate from fisheries. Drift nets, lost nets, discarded nets. There's a lot of nets that get lost at sea that end up in that gyre, and they're just breaking down. Regenerative aquaculture is absolutely a way to raise fish in a more sustainable way, to reduce the discarding of plastics in the middle of the ocean in a much more controlled, predictable environment. Jacques Cousteau famously said, the mark of civilization was the transition from hunters and gatherers to farmers. And we, as stewards of the ocean, need to learn how to farm in the ocean to transition from extractive fishing into responsible farming. But the nuance here is we need to raise these fish and shellfish in a healthy way. So how we farm in the oceans should not mimic how we farm in commodity agriculture. It should mimic regenerative aquaculture. We absolutely can produce huge abundance of seafood in high density integrated multi-trophic environments in the same way that a rainforest or a coral reef can produce an abundance of life through all of these integrated systems. When we raise finfish in proximity to kelp and shellfish and bottom feeders like the sea urchins and the lobster, you have these high density symbiotic relations that produce healthier environments and healthier fish. And you can do this in places that previously were dead zones, right? We have the ability to raise fish in a healthier way. We just need to demand better farming practices and better healthier fish, right? At least that's my insight, is that we've talked about more sustainable practices in the ocean for many, many years, and it didn't really do much. Like, there's not one seafood company out there that doesn't say they're sustainable.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Show me one. I'd be
That's
very
so
surprised.
true. Yeah.
What we need is to demand better practices that are quantifiable. And the one thing that I have found that is quantifiable and is actually affecting change is demanding higher levels of omega-3s, EPA and DHA, lower levels of mercury, because the only way to do that is to control the feed and optimize for microalgae fed. And when you start doing that, it's like demanding grass-fed beef.
Yeah.
Why? Because you want beef that's raised not on omega-6 rich corn.
Right.
You want the same thing with fish. I want the same thing with fish. I want to be able to feed my family the original super nutrient. I want my kids to grow up on DHA rich proteins. And we can do that when we have direct access to clean seafood that's raised on very specific diets.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I mean, this is probably hyperbolic, but also from that documentary, there was a stat that we might empty the oceans by 2048 just from overfishing with commercial fishing. So, like, do you think there's any place for wild, like, ocean fishing in the way it's being done? Like, or is really the best shot for the ocean, for ocean health and quality seafood for people at this point, given how much plastic and mercury is in these smaller fish that the bigger fish are eating? Like, would it be best for there to be like an era where we kind of do, maybe it's not possible, but like, would that be the best situation for the ocean, do you think?
Yeah.
While the
I
ocean
think
gets healthier?
the oceans definitely need to get healthier, right? And that 2050 date has been disputed many times, but there are very eminent and imperative changes that need to happen, right? We are changing the oceans every day by not taking enough action to change it, right? So my vision is that one day we will be able to fish from the oceans, and that we should have healthy, abundant oceans. But in the same way that when you go to the Serengeti, you don't go hunting wildebeests, or definitely you don't go hunting lions, right? Because there's so few of them left. We've created these national parks, these wildlife protection areas. And we need to do the same in the ocean. We need to have an interconnected network of marine protected areas, because a lot of these fish, these beautiful, large migratory species that, like tuna, for example, that swim all the way from Japan back to California, they are part of these larger ecosystems, and you can't just protect one little corner. You have to connect the migratory paths, the nurseries, the hatcheries, and you have to create an environment where they can rebuild the whole health, right? Because they're interconnected. And to do that, how do we relieve pressure on that? Well, if we're just talking about relieving pressure then we should probably stop industrial scale extraction. And we've demonstrated that we can raise fish. In fact, today, more than 60% of seafood consumed around the world comes from aquaculture.
Really? But a lot of that's the farming practices that we're not.
The majority of it is that,
Big, like conventional farming. Yeah.
A lot of it is still dependent on bait fish. There's still quite a lot of aquaculture that is fed anchovetas as they grind it up into fish meal and fish oil. And there's a growing interest in krill from the Arctic, which is potentially absolutely devastating to the base layer of the Arctic food chain that feeds so much of the planet, right? So we need to scale systems that are truly scalable, not dependent on natural resources. If we do this right, we can feed our communities truly scalably, sustainably, and allow nature to rebuild, because she's incredibly resilient.
Right.
When you look at marine protected areas like off the coast of southern Baja, there's a famous marine protected area called Cabo Pulmo, and 35 years ago they had completely depleted their local waters by allowing not just the local fishermen, but international fishermen, like Chinese fishermen and different people that come in and fish those waters. And it was devastated to the point where the local community was broke and dependent on government subsidies.
Wow.
And the matriarch of the community said, let's do something different. Let's stop allowing people to come in and fish here. Let's protect our waters. There used to be a beautiful coral reef here. Let's see what happens. And they banded together and they protected 20 miles of coastline. And in 20 years, that community's gross domestic income has increased so much, and they still do not fish there. They've become one of the most well-known ecotourism destinations in the world and diving sites in the world, because that little 20-mile site has rehabilitated so rapidly and with so much abundance of life that people want to come around the world, and they now make more money just doing dive tours and things of that nature than they ever did just fishing, right? So when we think differently about how the value of these resources, when we raise fish in these sort of systems, like we work with some aquaculture facilities that are inside of marine protected areas where it's a no fishing zone, but they're allowed to do aquaculture there because those specific principles of how it's being raised are demonstratedly having a minimal, if not no impact or a positive impact on the environment.
Wow.
And the whole ecosystem has a benefit while the perimeter of those parks are getting fished.
Yeah.
That is really interesting to see that we can raise fish going all the way back to when I was a kid, and this guy telling me we could raise these steelhead trout. We could raise them in captivity, reintroduce them in the wild, raise them to maturity, sell them to the local community. That model is happening today, and we just need more of that.
Cool. Wow. That's a beautiful example. Okay, I have like 5 quick questions, just kind of rapid fire, that I'm just are reflecting on before we end this conversation. I really want to feel like I have my head wrapped around regenerative aquaculture, and I'm sure we know we're just touching the surface of it, but like little follow-up questions, so I really feel like I understand it. One, just quick question: where does the mercury in the fish come from?
Yeah.
Why are all the fish filled with mercury?
Coal.
I feel like okay, yeah, go ahead.
We've been using coal fire plants for so long. That's probably the biggest contributor. Coal, yeah. So the emissions from coal goes into the atmosphere, and mercury is one of the biggest pollutants in the effluent, and it falls back down into our river systems and goes down the lakes and gets consumed by phytoplankton, and it sticks into the fatty tissues, and it works its way up the food chain and bioaccumulates. So yeah, the levels of mercury in the ocean today are like 300% higher than they were at the beginning of the industrial revolution.
Coal, but not other forms of focil fuels so much. Like,
I think that's the biggest one. It comes from a lot of places, but the studies that I've read show that was the largest contributor. But it comes from a lot of places. It's essentially naturally occurring. It comes out in volcanoes as well, but coal has been the biggest releaser of effluent, is my understanding. Okay,
second question: the algae feed that is being given to the fish, how does that get grown? Is that grown on land? Is that grown in the sea? Like, how does that, what is the process of making algae?
Generally, the most efficient way to grow it at an industrial scale is on land. They're doing it in ponds. They're doing it in laboratories. They're doing it in like vertical plexiglass systems that have, sunlight allowing it to photosynthesize, and then they're generally taking it and fermenting it to extract the oils into like a large brewery type of model, and then turning it into these omega rich oils for feeds primarily for aquaculture, but also other feeds, and it's also becoming more and more popular for a lot of the beauty industry is seeking out these oils, these algae-based oils, and then the omega-6s and the 9s end up in different uses as well. Like I've seen like algae cooking oil and some of these other interesting things that you want to look a little closer at, like what type of omega is it? Just because it's an omega doesn't mean that it's omega-3s. But is it a decent high temperature cooking oil? Probably, yeah, but just FYI, it's like through this extraction process, they're able to isolate like omega-3s, but they also produce other oils that get sold into other industries. Just FYI.
Okay. You mentioned also that on the pregnancy issue that like sushi might be back on the table for pregnant women, like raw fish, if it's sourced properly, and that eating, I know you probably can't recommend this, but like even in your family, like your wife ate raw fish while she was pregnant. Can you just quickly outline like what you said? Parasites is the main reason why pregnant women are meant to avoid raw fish. Why is that less of an issue or a non-issue with Seatopia?
Once upon a time, I used to sell whole fresh fish to restaurants, and we got the opportunity to also sell to a cruise line. That one of the farm table chefs, he got a commission to do a restaurant on this particular cruise line. And so all of a sudden I was like, okay, that's cool. Like, how do we do that? And the cruise line the chef required that they have our fish on the menu, right? So I was able to start selling to this cruise ship. It didn't last very long, but for like a year, they had this specific restaurant. And they required that all fish adhere to the FDA's guidelines for parasite destruction. So we learned about the specific methodologies that are demonstrated to kill parasites.
Oh God.
And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's freezing at specific temperatures for specific periods of time.
Okay.
If you put a fish with parasites in your home freezer, it will not kill the parasites. It's not cold enough.
Okay.
The guidelines were something like negative 30 degrees requires 7 days at that temperature. Negative 60 degrees was 24 hours. But you have to keep it at a very low temperature for a minimum period of time to kill any potential pathogenic parasites. That's the FDA guidelines for parasite destruction. Just so happens that when you blast freeze or nitrogen freeze seafood, you're oftentimes adhering to that first principle of the low temperature, and then the way that we store our fish also adheres to that. So we are ensuring that there's no potential living pathogens in any of the Seatopia products because of the way that it's frozen. It just so happens that most premium sushi restaurants do the same thing, right? Like if you go fishing in Alaska with a guide and you catch a beautiful king salmon and you fillet it open and you try to eat it, the fishing guide's gonna be like, that's how people die. Don't eat that. You need to either cook it or freeze it. And the way you freeze it matters depending on the type of parasites that are in there. But the FDA guidelines are pretty clear based on very sound data on how to kill those pathogenic parasites.
So what I'm hearing is that just the way that you freeze the fish right when it's processed essentially adheres to the same type of freezing guidelines that would kill pathogens anyways.
Any potential pathogen, but on top of that, all of the feeds that are getting manufactured are also certified parasite free.
Oh wow.
So we have this dual layer of trust and comfort because the fish are eating a diet that has been manufactured in an ISO 1000 facility, and it doesn't have parasites in it, right? It was clean to begin with. Parasites get into fish generally because they're eating like bottom feeders. They're going and they're eating crustaceans or isopods or various things that they're just going around scavenging, and they're getting parasites in them. When they're in a clean, controlled environment, in eating a clean, controlled feed, and then they're harvested in a way where at peak freshness they're blast frozen and subjected to those like negative 30 degrees and kept at those temperatures for, in our case, 60 days.
Wow.
That gives us the trust that not only was it not exposed to parasites, but any potential for there to be a parasite has been removed.
So when people are buying fish and they're worried about parasites, it's not that the parasites are entering the fish like in the grocery store or after. It's like the fish had parasites when they were alive and they did not get killed in the processing. Like, is that, like they ate something, is that accurate, would you say? Like the fish, they were sick fish and then you're eating sort of a sick fish. But if it was a healthy fish and it was flash frozen in the way, or frozen in the way that you're talking about, you're kind of ensured that you're not going to it's not going to pick up a parasite while you're defrosting it or while it's in your fridge at home.
I'm not going to speak for what happens in grocery stores and fresh product, because a fresh product could be exposed to anything, but it's difficult to introduce a parasite into a frozen fish that's already in a vacuum seal bag that's kept at -30 degrees.
Wow.
And delivered to you on dry ice, with a thermometer in there that validates that it was kept at that temperature throughout the entire cold chain. And then the other thing that we do with Seatopia specifically is we tell all of our customers, if it's not frozen on arrival, document that and we'll replace it. That is the trust that you need in order to eat something raw.
Right.
If you don't know that it arrived frozen, if you don't know that it wasn't frozen throughout the whole supply chain, if you don't know what temperature it was frozen, if you don't know what it ate, then you're at risk.
Yeah. Wow.
But when you start adding all of that up, you can eat fish the way it was intended to be eaten, the way our ancestors ate it, because the triglyceride form of those long-chain omega-3s is what my body wants to digest, not the ethyl ester form of a shelf-stable omega-3 supplement that makes me feel burpy.
Wow. So it's actually a different version of omega-3 if you're eating it raw versus in a capsule?
It is a different form of omega-3 that your liver just immediately uses, as opposed to having to convert it.
Wow. Wow. I think we should just end there. This is so amazing. I mean, I think that I like the fact that, just in this phase of life, so many pregnant friends wanting to have kids soon, this is a game changer to think about, having the option to have safe fish that's quality controlled and tested and potentially could be eaten raw. The benefits to the mom, the benefits to the baby, the sense of anxiety that comes along with eating fish. It's incredible what you're doing. Do you want to share just briefly with people a little? We haven't actually talked that much about Seatopia. I feel like it's been such a great educational conversation. But tell people how the service works, the subscription model, and how they can try it. How do they get some of this amazing magic in their house?
They just sign up. We have this quirky little URL, seatopia.fish. You just go there, pick out what you want, and we ship it to your door. All of our shipping is carbon neutral. Our packaging is eco-friendly, and it arrives with sushi-grade, super frozen seafood that has a certificate of analysis on all the products, quantifying the cleanliness and the nutrients. And if you want more, we send you more.
Okay, but you have to talk about the delivery schedule when it comes with the moon. This is my favorite part. Are you still doing it that way?
No.
Oh, damn. Okay.
Once upon a time, when we first launched Seatopia, and my wife and I were still living on a boat, we were working with a very small budget. We only had a small number of customers, and we wanted to work with a third-party logistics company. And they said, you're not big enough to fulfill orders as they come in. And I said, well, what if we only fulfilled once a month? And we took orders all month long and then just fulfilled once a month. They're like, okay, we'll do it. And being quirky hippies living on a boat, we're like, well, what if instead of it just being on the first every month, what if we aligned the delivery with the full moon? So every month, the deliveries would go out the week of the full moon so that all of our customers would receive this beautiful box of seafood on the full moon, and there was recipes in there, and we'd all be sharing recipes.
So cool. Eating
this in observance of the full moon, and that kind of created a really cool community of people who were attuning their attention to the rhythms of nature in a way that I think is important and often overlooked in society.
Wow, that's so neat. I love that that's part of the history, but now it sounds like people can actually get a delivery on demand.
Yes.
Because you're growing, and that's amazing.
Yes, now we're big enough to be able to be fulfilled on a regular basis. So
awesome.
As long as you place your order by a Tuesday, it gets delivered, I think, that same week. And,
wow.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for chatting. And it was a masterclass in ocean life and regenerative aquaculture. Thank you so much for what you're doing. And I really appreciate your work. Thank you.
My pleasure. I feel like we just scratched the surface, but I appreciate you asking these questions and being part of this movement to eat cleaner, healthier foods for the environment. It's really, really important for people to care where their food comes from and to make decisions that affect farms and the environment and our health, right? It's a powerful vote.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. Yay. Yay. Oh, you know what I forgot? I forgot to
That's a sale.
Is it
Shopify.
for you guys? Oh, that's awesome.
So good.
Talk about the energy. Someone's like,